One of the audience said to one of the panelists, "Do you think AI is going to take our jobs?" And these three guys looked at each other because they all heard this question before, and it was the elephant in the room.
Welcome to Asite, the Common Ground podcast. Today I'm joined by the Managing Director of Luminova, Lawrence Matthews. Welcome.
Hi, Javed. It's great to be here.
Tell me a little bit about Luminova, your company.
So Luminova started in the early 2000s, and at that time we were a group of lighting designers, and so we were a lighting design company, but we worked for architects largely on big projects, shopping centres, that kind of thing, and we helped them by building models and proving that their lighting design worked.
And how has that evolved over time? So I understand that that's kind of how you started, kind of architectural lighting design, and how have you evolved over the past 20, 25 years?
So what we found was that at that time design was done in 2D, so we found ourselves making 3D models to prove lighting design, and so we found that we were being asked to make 3D models for other reasons, such as, to animate through those buildings so that the stakeholders could understand what that building would look like at the end before it was built.
Okay, so over the years, as your organisation has progressed and matured, what are some of the kind of basic reasons why people want visualizations, the type that you produce?
Well, planning a building comes with some consequences, which are you don't really know what it's going to look like until it's built. Mm-hmm. So then if the client wants to make a change or wants to deviate from the design, then that has to be done after the build's finished. Whereas if you see the building in its in its realistic glory before it's built, you can make those decisions before you start turning soil.
Absolutely. And in today's world, where you're using various modelling applications anyway to construct, virtual design construction, for example, why would you need an additional level of visualization such as yours?
A non-technical stakeholder, the building owner, for example, would make much more sense out of what Luminova creates in a visualization rather than looking at, the viewport from Revit, say. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to have some education to understand what you're looking at with that viewport. I
completely agree. I mean, certainly I've got a bit of a modelling background as well. And I think you need to be fairly technical to kind of understand some of the visualizations in a viewport in certain applications versus being able to really understand that scene, the light, the shadows being cast, the materials being used, get a sense of space from the perspective using a visualization. So certainly as a communication tool, feels like it's a lot more effective.
It is, because you expect to stand at a balcony in a shopping centre or an airport and take in the view, and so that's difficult to portray using engineering tools. Yes. But it's beautiful in a visualization world.
Yeah, and certainly I can imagine to members of the public, and as you mentioned earlier, non-technical people, that adds a lot of value.
It does, yeah, because you get to see what's being built today before construction even starts.
Absolutely. So just now we're talking about that, tell me about some of the range of projects and some of the stuff that you've worked on, exciting projects you've worked on over the past 20-odd years.
Well, I mentioned infrastructure, and that's really the heart of where we've been working and still work today. So, anything from large airports that you might find in this country, or in the Middle East, we've worked on large horse racing tracks, large international gardens in Saudi Arabia, large hospitals in the Middle East. All of those infrastructure projects, which all have stakeholders of different kinds who appreciate and need to know what that is going to look like at the end.
Can you take me through an example of an infrastructure project where what's the design brief? How have they commissioned you to be involved?
An architect and a structural engineer would be selected, but also at the same time, it became commonplace for a visualizer to be selected for the process, and people picked us because we were very good at the larger model sets, and so we were able to pull together vast amount of information quickly and render quickly. And so you would get a result particularly say on an airport where you needed design review every 2 weeks. We were able to turn that huge volume and huge, if you like, traffic of information around very quickly and effectively present each fortnight, where's that design up to.
So that's really interesting. So I didn't realise they're using your visualizations, and so I'm assuming you've worked on some airports in the UK, Heathrow, for example, that they were using using your visualizations for design reviews every fortnight.
Correct.
And what types of things would they be assessing?
So each fortnight you would see the progression of the design, because we would take the 3D and where it was still 2D and bring it together, federate those models from the architect, from the structural engineers, and bring together the whole design and look through those 50 lenses, if you like. And of course, each fortnight, you'd be at a new stage, you'd be further advanced.
Absolutely. Give me a sense of the complexity and scale of some of the projects. So again, we talked about Heathrow Airport. What is the kind of scale we're looking at here?
Well, a building like that, you might be thinking of 20 football pitches. I mean, it's enormous.
Wow. That is huge. Okay. And in terms of complexity, when architects create models now, we used to talk about level of detail, now level of information need, which is kind of commensurate with the amount of information you might find being modeled virtually. What sort of detail would you go into for a visualization? I'm imagining it would almost be like how it would look in reality. So a lot of detail.
Absolutely. The main emphasis is the light and the materials, because the geometry is largely these days being made by the architect and the structural engineer. So what we though do is we bring that together, materialize it, light it, so that you can see effectively, how that space will look and feel. You can almost feel the air conditioning. As for getting it down to the nuts and bolts and screws of a hinge level, we don't normally do that, because from where you're standing, you don't really see that. But you do need the look and the feel of the space.
So I'm guessing that if you're obtaining the models from an architect, you have to wait till the model has developed to a certain level of maturity in order to visualize a high level of detail model, which will be commensurate with what the actual end product would look like.
You do, but we always start at the beginning. No matter what there is available, we bring that into the model and start at the concept stage.
Okay.
And then as you move through the various stages of the build, you do get more detail by default. But to begin with, it's still helpful from a spatial point of view.
Okay. And are you rendering a realistic view, even at concept stage, right through to your final visualization?
Sure. Well, at the beginning it might just be a form model because there haven't been materials selected, so it might be just a white model.
Yeah.
But really what you want to do in that design review process is present everything that's available. Because not only are you seeing what's there, you're seeing what's not there.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about realistic, so obviously your model is maturing in terms of realism. The final output, how would you describe realism to be? Because I've heard of the terms photorealistic, etc., but how would you define it?
It's convincing enough to. I remember one project we were on. The client said that the building looks exactly like your video.
All right. So that's almost photorealistic.
It gives you a good impression of what the space will look like.
Okay, and I'm guessing that has shadows, it has the correct lighting depending on the position of the building and time in the
time of day, time of year. So if for example you're in the Middle East, it's really important because the facade engineering creates certain screening from the sun. Right. So you need to, when you say realistic, you want to be able to see what light is getting into the building, what light's being kept out by that facade engineering, just as one example.
So you're obviously looking at shadows, you're looking at even refractions and reflections in glass, so that's
so there is a real science to creating the materials to make sure they look right.
Okay, so that feels very realistic to me.
And I guess that's That's what realistic means.
Right. Okay. Excellent. And can you talk me through some other projects? So you mentioned earlier kind of a race course in the Middle East.
So we worked on Nad Al Sheba, which is in Dubai. At the time, it was coming up to the Dubai Cup. The client had a building that was coming together really quickly, but they wanted to advertise. So now, in that case, and this is all about different reasons why you might hire organisations like Luminova, we put together, the horses on the track, the people in the grandstand, the building itself, but we put on a show that could be advertised to bring to the attention of, the general public that here we have a racecourse that's opening, beginning of next year.
So sometimes your material is used in marketing as well as visualization.
Certainly. So, design review is one reason, marketing, is another. So one's, during the course of the project, and one's, at the end when it's time to open.
And do you know about these use cases when you start, or is that organically developed as different people see the visualization as you create it? No,
I mean the audience is important. We always need to know, why we're doing it and who that audience is, because in a design review you won't need horses on a track, for example, but that's the theatre that's created for that kind of audience.
And give me a sense of scale for that race course. Was it just a race course? Were there other elements attached to that? And give a sense of scale as well.
That particular job was enormous. In terms of scale, it had a marina, it had a normal size horse racing track, it had a hotel, it had entertainment areas. It was really quite a lifestyle area for the people of Dubai.
And who were the stakeholders in that particular?
In that case, it was the king. I mean, it was his course. He's a great enthusiast, and his team were very keen to make sure that he could understand as well as, the general public as to what was being built.
Okay, and you also did King Abdullah's International.
Yes, so the distant cousins across the way in Saudi Arabia. This project was the clues in the name. It's the King Abdullah International Garden, and no one had visualised this particular project. We were asked to do it. It was and is the size of Regent's Park in London. It's absolutely enormous and had something in the order of about 100,000 botanicals. And so we were asked to represent those as well as we could, including vastly different environments, butterfly enclosures, prehistoric areas, you name it, bird enclosures. It's a vast place with all sorts of different environments.
And just for a sense of, so you've mentioned actually the geographic space, but in terms of modelling, like how many models or how many polygons would something like that
I don't know.
be?
That's a great question, but think of Regent's Park and how complicated that is. As far as the park itself and the surrounding suburb, it was the same sort of complexity.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And how long did that take to create?
I think that took around 3 to 4 months. For one thing, we had to, create all the botanicals that we were showing off, but also the project was drawn in 2D, so we had to create a 3D model of the entire space. So
you didn't get digital terrain models available to you? You had to create that
We
yourself?
were given contour drawings,
right.
So we had to create the 3D from 2D.
Okay, wow. And how do you create the botanicals? Do you have to work with a botanist for that, or was that just something you had to create from reference pictures?
A bit of both. And there are some, at the time we did that particular project, there were some libraries where you could buy botanicals, but at the same time, if you didn't have those available, you would need to make them from, as you say.
And sort of moving forwards to, so we've talked about kind of sophisticated visualization, and now a bit of a marriage between your visualization and 3D Repo, which is an Asite 3D rendering tool. Can you tell me a bit more about Hyperview and 3D Repo collaboration? So
Hyperview is the Luminova, if you like, platform that sits on top of a game engine. And we've developed that as our modelling base, if you like. there was a time where 3D Repo and Luminova got together, and we looked at the raw data that was kept on the server, and looked at the engineering viewport, and took that data through an API and brought it into our platform, and produced a real-time viewport of what was basically Revit data on the server.
Wow. Okay.
So, and the example that we were using was of a development in Stratford in London. So really large site, 20 buildings, complex Revit models, complex landscaping, and we were able to bring that data out of 3D Repo and onto, if you like, a browser in living colour.
And just to check, is that real time? So when a change has occurred and a drawing or model has been up revisioned, when I then go to visualize that, I don't need to wait for render time. That's just real time.
Absolutely. It's real time, real materials, real lighting, based on that revision.
And realistic.
And realistic.
Brilliant. And that's really powerful. And do you see that being the kind of the future maybe of common data environments, of being able to do that in a cloud environment? Because right now you often have 3D viewers that are connected to CD environments that aren't providing that level of realism.
Look, I think it's the next step, and I think the more people that look at developing that kind of use case, eventually it'll be commonplace. But I think at the moment it's a great idea, and I would heavily promote it because you're getting visualization at all times during the project, as opposed to having to create visualization that becomes redundant.
And in terms of insights, other than the future belief that CDEs will have better rendering capabilities sort of on cloud, is there anything else that you kind of see could be happening in the future?
Look, I think if we could have those two things where CDEs were being piped into a realistic viewport right the way through the life of the project, and if we focus on helping that process become more effective using AI, if both of those situations were commonplace, I think that's what I see as the future.
Talk through an example of, I believe at one point that you, it was assumed that you were using Unreal when actually you had developed an animation in Unity that was very advanced and sophisticated.
That is a true story. Okay. We had created a huge real estate project in Unity.
Okay.
And we were showing a couple of Unreal guys what we'd made, and at least one of them thought it had been made in Unreal.
Right. Okay. And just talk me through the complexity of this model. Like, again, what was the scale, number of polygons? Why would they think this was done in Unreal?
I think that Luminova brings with it infrastructure visualization skills, and so we poured our energy into the Unity model and created a very realistic looking outcome, which happened to be as good as Unreal projects that were around at the time.
It's quite ironic, really, that it was Unreal individuals themselves who thought it was an Unreal project.
It was interesting. It was unexpected. I went to an AI get together, and it was presented by 3 AI experts, and it was attended by architects and engineers largely, and some real estate people. Anyway, one of the audience said to one of the panelists, "Do you think AI is going to take our jobs?" And these 3 guys looked at each other because they've all heard this question before, and it was the elephant in the room for most people in the room, I think. They were all looking at going, okay, so what's the answer? And the answer was that AI is being adopted, and if you've got 2 identical people in an organisation, you might find that person A adopts AI as part of their job, and person B may not. And the answer from their perspective was that AI won't take your job, but out of those two, the person who masters it, they will keep the job. And I thought that was a really interesting and very thought-provoking and probably the right answer. If you, as part of your job today, embrace AI and use it wherever you can, legally and morally, in the right way, I think you're better off doing that than
shying away from it.
Shying away from it, fearing it, thinking it's going to take your job. It won't. That guy over there will.
So for you, clearly, AI isn't a fear to take away jobs from your sector.
No, I think it's a great thing. An enabler is a great way of putting it. I think that's exactly what it is.
But do you have any other fears in your industry?
Well, I'd love to have some dramatic answer for that, but to be perfectly honest, I don't right now.
And I guess with the games engine, it's not only the power of the visualization, but the interactivity you can introduce into that. So I remember seeing a visualization, I think it was Earl's Court area, and there were kind of like flashing arrows on the ground, and it was like a game showing you which path to walk.
Oh, right, yeah.
And, being able to set settings, different time of the day, different time of the year. Yeah. Is it raining? Is it sunny? So immediately within the one environment, I've got a number of different settings. I mean, you can teleport, you can move, you can see a map view, you can interact with objects and people even. So all of this gives it a much richer experience. And I guess this is kind of developing and maturing in terms of what type of interactivity you introduce.
Yes, I think so. And that can only be done using a game engine, just for one. But what you've highlighted there is build the model once, use it many times in different ways. I think that's very powerful. So the client's paid for the geometry to be put together, materialise it, light it, but then you're stepping back and creating a UI and tools to move you through that space, as you pointed out, at different times of day, with some, UI guidance. So, that's a great efficiency of the original model build.
And I can imagine like crowd simulation or even kind of deflection and all kinds of, heat maps that tell you all kinds of different elements can all be kind of visualized in there and shown. So some real powerful usage from an engineering perspective.
I also think that what you're combining there is people from the AEC and data sets that you might find at Asite of a huge complex. You mentioned Earl's Court. So all of that sits on the Asite system, and then it's drawn out potentially into this game engine world, and you're combining the skills of game makers all of a sudden with people from AEC. So you're bringing two industries together to
produce this rich output,
allow stakeholders and users to make use of that data set, but also the visualizer skills and game maker skills. So that's again, the sum of those parts is far greater than it was to begin with.
And that's a really good point, because now you're talking about how visualization is useful to end users. So they can start to visualize the spaces that they're going to be working in, whether it's like a doctor or a surgeon in the case of a hospital, or airport traffic control in an airport. And they really need to understand that space because of their operating environment. And so it lends itself, visualization is now adding extra value, not just to the stakeholders in the construction part of it, but also to the end users who are going to be there operationally. And as you mentioned previously, into the kind of the asset and facilities management, this model can be reused and ongoing training exercises for how to manage that building thereafter. So it does make absolute sense that you're adding greater value to these larger, more expensive infrastructure projects. And I like the fact that how you kind of phrased it, looking at kind of, high millions, low billions would be your kind of mark for adding value.
I think so. I mean, another hospital example that we're looking at right now, which is in Southeast Asia, it's an enormous complex. It's a government complex, and they're looking at the hyperview because There's a data set that's very similar to what you might find on Asite. And this particular hospital, one of the spin-offs of recent times being COVID, is that they decided to, when they build it, to make the hospital very flexible so that you could go from normal use to pandemic use. And to explain that is best done using things like the Hyperview with the data that's sitting on Asite right now.
It's a really good use case.
So we'll probably get that job, and we'll be proud of it because we'll really help these people understand how such a building can go from A to B.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Lawrence.
Thanks for having me over.
It.